She landed her $300 million jet at a forgotten airstrip in the middle of nowhere and walked straight past the one man who could have saved everything she'd built. Victoria Caldwell didn't look at Nathan Cole when she stepped off that plane. Why would she? He was standing in the doorway of a rust-stained hangar with grease on his hands and a coffee thermos that had seen better days. She looked through him the way people like her always do. That was her first mistake. If you're new here, hit subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next will remind you that the most dangerous person in the room is usually the one nobody bothered to notice. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The engine warning came at 31,000 feet, somewhere over eastern Oklahoma, and it was the kind of warning that a pilot with good instincts doesn't dismiss. Captain Drew Mercer had been flying for Victoria Caldwell for 6 years. He'd ferried her to board meetings in Zurich, to charity galas in Dubai, to private islands she'd never bothered to name out loud. He knew her rhythms, her preferences, her tolerance for disruption, which was somewhere between 0 and none. He knew that she liked her bourbon poured before she finished her second email, that she used silence as a weapon better than most people used words, and that she had fired 2 members of her ground crew for being 3 minutes late with a fuel truck. He also knew that the amber light now glowing on his instrument panel was not a glitch. He glanced at his first officer, a younger man named Paulson, who was already pulling up the fault code on the secondary display. ENG2, oil press. While the indicator blinked steady, not erratic, which was somehow worse. Erratic meant sensor drift. Steady meant the sensor was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. I see it, Mercer said quietly. Diversion? Paulson asked. Mercer was already scanning the sectional chart on his screen. The closest major airport was Tulsa International, 40 minutes away in good conditions. But good conditions meant normal traffic, and normal traffic meant a public diversion, which meant photographers and wire services, and the kind of story that followed a woman like Victoria Caldwell for weeks. There was a regional field, though. Harlan County Municipal, 22 minutes northeast with a paved runway long enough for the Caldwell G700, and according to the database, an FBO and a maintenance facility on field. He picked up the handset. Miss Caldwell. He kept his voice even because that was his job. We're showing a pressure anomaly in the number 2 engine. Nothing critical at the moment, but I'd like to put down at a regional field while we get eyes on it. Shouldn't take long. A pause. The kind of pause that had its own weight. How long is not long, Drew? A few hours? Could be a sensor, could be something else. I'd rather know which before we push through to New York. Another pause. He could hear her thinking, not processing, but calculating. Schedules, calls, the acquisition meeting she had on Tuesday morning that was already rescheduled twice. Fine, she said, but I want us back in the air by tonight. Mercer didn't answer that. He keyed the radio instead. Harlan County Municipal Airport sat at the edge of a town that had never quite figured out what it wanted to be. The main street had a diner, a farm supply store, a VFW hall, and a barbershop with a hand-painted sign that hadn't been updated since the 90s. The airport itself was 3 miles east of town down a 2-lane road that buckled at the shoulder where the frost heaves had never been properly repaired. There were 2 hangars. The newer one, if you could call it that, had been built in the early 2000s with a county infrastructure grant and housed a small charter operation that ran twice-weekly puddle jumpers to Oklahoma City. The other hangar was older, sided in corrugated steel that had gone from silver to brown to something closer to rust orange over the decades. A faded windsock hung above the door, turning slow and easy in the afternoon breeze. Nathan Cole's truck was parked beside that older hangar, the same place it was parked every morning by 6:30. It was a 2009 F250 white once, now a color that could generously be described as off-white and less generously as primer gray. The rear bumper had a crease in it from a loading dock he'd backed into 3 winters ago, and he hadn't bothered to fix it because it still worked fine, and he'd grown tired of fixing things that still worked fine. He was inside when the Caldwell jet touched down. He heard it before he saw it, the distinctive high whine of high-bypass turbofans on approach, cleaner and quieter than the piston traffic that usually drifted through Harlan County. He set down the fuel flow valve he'd been calibrating and walked to the hangar door, wiping his hands on a rag that was already well past its useful life. The G700 rolled toward the ramp with the particular slowness of aircraft that cost more than most counties' annual budgets. Its paint scheme was white with a diagonal navy stripe and the Caldwell Aviation logo in gold near the tail. An eagle mid-flight, wings swept back, which Nathan had always thought was a little on the nose. He watched it park. He watched the air stairs lower. He watched Victoria Caldwell step down onto Harlan County tarmac and pull her sunglasses from her jacket pocket in one smooth motion, sliding them on before she'd taken her second step. The practiced move of someone who expected cameras everywhere and had learned to armor herself preemptively. She was taller than he expected, though he didn't know why he'd had an expectation at all. He'd seen her face on the cover of 3 business magazines and once on a cable news segment about the consolidation of the private aviation market, but photographs and reality are never quite the same. In photographs, she looked precise, controlled, composed in the way that people who have professional media coaches tend to look. In person, she looked tired in a way the photographs were paid not to show. Her pilot came down the stairs behind her, and then a woman who was clearly an assistant, already on the phone, already walking fast. Victoria looked toward Nathan's hangar, and for a moment her expression did something complicated. Not quite disgust, more like involuntary recalibration, the look of someone who has arrived somewhere and found it substantially below expectation. She turned to her assistant. "Is this the maintenance facility?" According to the database, yes. The assistant's voice had the practiced neutrality of someone paid to confirm things diplomatically. "It looks like a storage shed." Nathan had already started walking toward them. He heard that. He was close enough to hear it clearly, and he watched her say it without lowering her voice, the way people speak when they've long since stopped considering that the person they're discussing might be within earshot, or when they simply don't care. He kept walking. "Nathan Cole," he said, stopping a few feet away. He didn't offer his hand right off. Both of them were still greasy, and he'd learned not to make that mistake with people in expensive clothes. "This is my facility. Your pilot radioed ahead?" Victoria's pilot, Mercer, stepped forward. "I did. ENG2 oil pressure, steady amber on approach. We brought it in clean, but I'd like it looked at before we continue." "Tail number?" "N44 Victor Charlie." Nathan nodded. "All right, let me get set up." He looked at Mercer, not Victoria. "Maintenance records on board?" "We can pull them. I'll need the last 12 months and whatever squawk history you've got on that engine." Victoria stepped slightly forward. It was a small motion, the kind that was meant to reestablish who was at the center of a conversation. "How long are we looking at?" Nathan looked at her then for the first time, really looked at her. She had the kind of face that was used to being looked at and used to not having to wait. "Depends what I find," he said. "I have a meeting in New York tomorrow morning. I need to know if this is something you can clear quickly or if I need to make other arrangements. I can't tell you that until I've looked at it." He paused. "And I won't guess." Something shifted in her expression. People didn't usually say that to her. They usually said something that rhymed with a timeline, even when they didn't have one, because that was what she wanted to hear. "Fine," she said. The same word she'd used with her pilot. The same weight. Mount. The inside of Nathan's hangar was not what people expected. That was something he'd made peace with years ago. From the outside, it looked like the kind of place where things went to be forgotten. From the inside, if you knew what you were looking at, it was something else entirely. The equipment was older, most of it. A lot of it was used, sourced over years from auctions and estates and the occasional bankrupt FBO. But it was maintained with the kind of meticulous care that comes from respecting tools more than you respect appearances. His diagnostic rig, a GE aviation-compatible engine analysis system, was not the newest on the market, but it was calibrated, certified, and capable of pulling fault data that most regional shops couldn't access. He'd spent 11 years as a propulsion engineer at a company called Hartwell Aerospace before the bottom fell out. Hartwell had been a mid-tier engine developer that had, for about a decade, been very quietly one of the most technically rigorous shops in the country. Nathan had worked on the certification program for 2 turbofan families, including the GE-derived series that powered the Gulfstream G700. He'd written portions of the maintenance manual. He'd sat in the FAA certification meetings. He'd argued in rooms full of people with better titles than his about compression ratios and inspection intervals and what the real-world tolerance margins looked like versus the ones that looked good on paper. And then Hartwell had been acquired, and the acquiring company had not been interested in most of Hartwell's people, and Nathan had been 39 years old with a daughter who was 11 and a marriage that had been running on fumes for 2 years before the acquisition finished it off. He'd taken his severance, his daughter, and a short-term lease on a house in Harlan County because his college roommate had mentioned the airport was looking for someone to run light maintenance, and it was a place to land while he figured out what came next. That had been 8 years ago. What came next had turned out to be this. He didn't think about Hartwell much anymore, not in the way that bruises you. He thought about it the way you think about a chapter that's closed, present sometimes, not pressing. He pulled the records from Mercer when the pilot brought them over. The maintenance logs came on a tablet, digitally organized the way Caldwell Aviation organized everything. Clean interface, color-coded, the kind of system that looked impressive in a boardroom presentation. Nathan scrolled through it at his workbench while Mercer stood nearby, and Victoria Caldwell's assistant had gone back to the jet to set up some kind of mobile office situation with a laptop and a folding table that the flight crew had apparently produced from somewhere in the aft cabin. Victoria herself had followed Nathan into the hangar uninvited, which he hadn't expected. He'd expected her to stay by the plane or to go sit somewhere air-conditioned and make calls. Instead, she was standing about 8 feet behind him, with her arms crossed and her sunglasses pushed up on top of her head, watching him work the way people watch airport security. Not with interest exactly, but with impatience wearing the costume of interest. He went through the records without talking. That was just how he worked. He'd tried talking while reading once, years ago, and found that it split his attention in a way that bothered him. The first time the ENG-2 oil pressure flag appeared in the logs was 14 months ago. A brief amber warning on a transatlantic crossing, noted by the crew, reviewed by Caldwell Aviation's maintenance dispatch, and closed out as a suspected sensor anomaly. A sensor was replaced. The aircraft returned to service. 4 months later, same flag. Different crew, same aircraft. Dispatch again. Closed as recurrent sensor issue, second sensor replaced, aircraft returned to service. Nathan stopped scrolling. He went back to the top and pulled up the fleet-wide Squawk database. Not just this tail number, but the full maintenance history that the records Mercer had provided gave him access to. It took him a few minutes to navigate the interface because it wasn't his system, and the search filters were buried under menus that clearly hadn't been designed by anyone who actually worked with maintenance records. But it was there. ENG-2 oil pressure flags. Across different aircraft, different tail numbers, different crews, different routes, but the same engine family, the same code, and the same disposition, over and over. Sensor anomaly, sensor replaced, return to service. 12 incidents. 14. He kept scrolling. 19. He set the tablet down. He stood there for a moment with his hand flat on the workbench and his eyes looking at something that wasn't in the room. Mr. Cole. He turned. Victoria was watching him, and her expression had changed slightly. Not softer, but different. Alert in a way that wasn't quite impatience anymore. You've been staring at that tablet for about 2 minutes without moving, she said. What did you find? He considered how to answer that. He'd been in enough rooms to know that what you said first mattered, and that how you said it mattered almost as much, and that the person in front of him was not the kind of person who responded well to being eased into bad news. I'm going to pull the borescope on your number 2 engine, he said. And then I'm going to pull the oil filter. And then I'm going to tell you what I found. That sounds like an answer to a different question. It's the honest answer to the question you actually asked. She held his eyes for a moment. Something moved behind hers. Not anger, not quite. More like the experience of being told no in a language she didn't hear very often. All right, she said. How long will that take? 90 minutes? Maybe 2 hours? She pulled out her phone. He went back to work. The borescope went in through the inspection port on the number 2 engine's high-pressure turbine section. and Nathan went through it methodically, quadrant by quadrant, the way he'd been taught to do by a man named Ehrlich at Hartwell, who had the patience of geology and the opinion that haste in borescope inspection was the aviation equivalent of reading a book by flipping to the last page. What he found was not catastrophic. Not yet. But it was real, and it was not a sensor problem. There was oil carbonization on 2 of the first-stage turbine blades. Not severe, but consistent with chronic low-pressure events that had been ongoing for long enough to leave their mark on the metal. The oil seal in the bearing cavity showed wear patterns that were outside normal tolerance. Not dramatically outside. Not emergency right now outside. But the kind of outside that meant the margin between normal operation and a significant problem was narrower than it was supposed to be, and getting narrower, and had been getting narrower for at least several months while the maintenance logs cheerfully recorded sensor replacements. He pulled out the borescope and spent 20 minutes on the oil filter. The filter told part of the same story in a different language. Metallic particulate at a concentration that was over the limit for return to service under the maintenance manual Nathan had helped write. He walked to the doorway of the hangar. Victoria was outside, sitting in a folding chair that had materialized from somewhere, her legs crossed, working her way through what appeared to be her 4th phone call. She looked up when she saw him. He waited. She wrapped up the call in 2 sentences, short, decisive, the way she did everything, and stood up. Well? The aircraft is not airworthy, Nathan said. Not in its current condition. The pause that followed was a different kind than the ones before it. This one had mass. It got us here, she said. It did. And I'm glad it did because what I'm finding inside that engine tells me you shouldn't push it any further until it's properly inspected and repaired. Your borescope equipment, is it? It's calibrated and certified, he said before she could finish the question because he knew where it was going and he wanted to get there first. Recertified 8 months ago. I can show you the documentation. She looked at him, then she looked at the jet, then back at him. What exactly are we talking about in terms of the repair? Bearing seal replacement at minimum, possibly first-stage turbine blade inspection and replacement depending on what a full teardown shows. This isn't a field repair, Miss Caldwell. This engine needs to go to a shop. How long? Weeks, not days. The word weeks landed on her the way heavy things land, not with a crash, but with a settling, a compression. I need to get to New York, she said. I know you do. I have a meeting that cannot be rescheduled again. I understand that. He held his ground, easy, without drama. And you can get to New York. There are charter options out of Tulsa, 40 minutes from here. Your assistant can probably have something arranged inside the hour. What you cannot do is get to New York on this aircraft. She turned away from him. He could see her jaw working slightly, the way people's jaws work when they're deciding how hard to push on something. I need you to sign a maintenance release, she said, still turned away. Conditional release, engine limitation noted. I'll have our team handle it in New York. No, he said. She turned back. Excuse me? I won't sign a release for an aircraft I've found to be unairworthy. That's not a negotiation. I'm sorry. Do you understand what a conditional maintenance release is? I'm not asking you to certify it as airworthy. I'm asking you to... I know what it is, he said, quietly. And I know what it means when someone flies on one and something goes wrong at altitude. I know what the NTSB report looks like, and what the family notifications look like, and what happens to the mechanic who signed that release. I know all of that. He looked at her steadily. I won't sign it. The silence between them was very clean. Mercer was standing 20 feet away, and he hadn't moved in a while. He was looking at the middle distance with the particular stillness of a man who has decided to be very professionally unavailable during a conversation he was absolutely hearing every word of. Victoria Caldwell looked at Nathan Cole for a long moment with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not anger, exactly. Or not only anger, something underneath it. Something that had been behind the tiredness he'd noticed when she stepped off the plane. I'll make arrangements, she said finally, and took out her phone. Nathan walked back into his hangar. He poured himself a coffee from the thermos on his workbench and sat down on his shop stool and looked at the maintenance records on the tablet again. 19 incidents, same code, same engine family, same disposition. All of them cleared. All of them sent back into the air. He thought about that for a while. Outside, he could hear Victoria's voice on the phone. Not the words, just the cadence of someone moving pieces around a board, solving problems that were inconvenient but solvable. She was good at that. He could tell. He supposed that if you built an empire on the back of problems solved, you got good at it. But there were problems you couldn't move around a board. He picked up the tablet again and started writing down tail numbers. The charter arrangements took Victoria's assistant, a woman named Priya, exactly 47 minutes to sort out. A Cessna Citation out of Tulsa, departing at 6:15, getting Victoria into Teterboro by 10:40 Eastern. Not ideal. Not what she'd planned, but functional, which was the standard she was applying to everything right now. Nathan heard all of this through the open hangar door without trying to. Sound carried differently in flat country, farther, cleaner, without buildings to break it up. He could hear Priya's voice rising and falling on the phone, the occasional word from Victoria, the footsteps of Mercer walking slow circles around the grounded jet, the way pilots do when they're unhappy and have nowhere useful to put it. He wasn't focused on any of that. He was focused on the tablet. He'd pulled up a legal pad from his desk drawer, actual paper, yellow, the kind that came in a 10-pack from the farm supply store in town, and he was writing down tail numbers and dates and the notation codes from the maintenance records, building a grid that his eyes could move across more naturally than a screen. He'd always thought better on paper. His ex-wife had called it a quirk. His old supervisor at Hartwell had called it inefficient. Nathan had called it the way he worked and left it at that. The pattern was clear when you laid it out by hand. 19 incidents had been his first count, scrolling through the records on the tablet's narrow interface. On paper, building the grid properly, he got to 23. 23 documented ENG, 2 oil pressure events across the Caldwell aviation fleet, all involving the same engine family, all flagged and then closed out with the same category of response: sensor anomaly, sensor replaced or rechecked, return to service authorized. The oldest one on the list was 16 months ago. The most recent, not counting today's, was 6 weeks back. A different tail number, a transatlantic route. The flag appeared on descent into Heathrow. Crew noted it, dispatch was contacted, a Caldwell maintenance representative in London looked at the aircraft and signed off on a sensor check. The plane flew back to New York 2 days later. Nathan stared at that entry for a while. The London rep certification number was in the record. He didn't recognize it, which meant nothing. He'd been out of the industry for 8 years and couldn't have named every certified maintenance tech in the country, let alone overseas. But the authorization code they'd used to close the squawk was one he did recognize. It was a Category 3 closure, which in the maintenance manual he'd helped write meant the fault was determined to be an instrumentation error with no further inspection required. A Category 3 closure on an oil pressure fault was not, strictly speaking, impossible. Sensors did fail. Pressure transducers in high heat environments had a finite life and sometimes threw phantom readings. He knew that. He'd written the procedures for verifying it. But you used a Category 3 closure after you'd ruled everything else out. You used it after you'd physically inspected the bearing housing and the seal condition and pulled the oil filter and checked the particulate count. You used it at the end of a process, not as a shortcut around one. He looked at the closure documentation attached to each incident. In 3 of the 23 cases, there was a full inspection protocol attached. Photographs, particulate analysis, bore scope imagery. In those 3 cases, the closures were defensible, maybe even correct. In the other 20, there wasn't. There was a sensor check, sometimes a sensor replacement, and then a return to service signature. He sat back on his stool and rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. The coffee in his thermos had gone cold about an hour ago. He drank it anyway. The thing about maintenance record analysis, the thing that took years to learn, was that the records themselves were almost never the whole story. They were a translation. A technician had been standing in front of an engine, seeing something, making a judgment call, and then reducing that entire physical, sensory, professional experience down to a series of checkboxes and codes and a signature. What you were reading, always, was not the truth of the machine. It was someone's interpretation of the truth, filtered through time pressure and supervisor expectations and the particular culture of the organization they worked for. Nathan had learned to read between the codes. He'd learned it at Hartwell, where they'd had an internal review process that picked apart maintenance decisions the way some companies picked apart financial models. It wasn't pleasant. It wasn't comfortable. But it meant that by the time he left, he understood how the culture of a maintenance organization shaped the records it produced, sometimes accurately, sometimes not. What he was reading in Caldwell Aviation's records had a particular shape. The Category 3 closures came fast. The return to service authorizations were consistent. There were no escalation notes, no requests for second opinions, no instances where a technician had flagged something and asked for the aircraft to be held for further review. 20 incidents, 20 quick resolutions, 20 birds back in the air. That wasn't how a careful organization operated. That was how an organization operated when the pressure to keep aircraft flying outweighed the pressure to understand why they kept flagging. He heard footsteps on the concrete approach to his hangar. He didn't look up yet. "Mr. Cole?" It was Victoria. He'd been half expecting her to leave with Priya to send the pilot or someone from her team to handle the formalities. Instead, she was standing in his doorway again, hands loose at her sides this time rather than crossed, which was a small change that he noticed without knowing quite what it meant. "Ms. Caldwell, my flight leaves Tulsa in 2 hours. I need to understand what the process looks like from here." She walked in without waiting to be invited, which he was getting used to. "For the aircraft, I'll write up my findings today. Formal squawk documentation supported by the borescope imagery and the oil filter report. The aircraft will need to go to an authorized engine repair facility. There's a Gulfstream authorized shop in Dallas and one in Atlanta. I'd recommend Atlanta because their turnaround on this engine series tends to be faster, but your maintenance coordinator will know better than I do." She was listening with a focus that was different from the impatience he'd seen earlier, sharper, more careful. "And the oil seal issue you mentioned, is it specific to this aircraft or—" "I don't know yet," he said. He tapped the legal pad. "That's what I'm trying to work out." She looked at the legal pad. She looked at the tablet beside it. She looked at the grid of tail numbers and dates he'd built across the yellow paper in his cramped engineer's handwriting. "What is that?" she said. "Your fleet's maintenance history, the portion your pilot's records gave me access to." "You've been building a—" She stopped. "What are you looking for?" He turned the pad toward her. "How many times has this engine code appeared in your fleet records in the last 16 months? She looked at the grid. She had the kind of intelligence that showed up as rapid comprehension. She wasn't studying the grid. She was reading it the way you read something you already have the language for. He watched her eyes track down the columns. "These are all the same code?" she said. "ENG2 oil pressure? Yes. Same fault family, different tail numbers, different dates. And you're saying these weren't properly investigated. I'm saying 20 of them were closed with a sensor check and a return to service authorization, without the physical inspection protocol the maintenance manual requires before you can use a Category 3 closure." He paused. "I know the manual. I helped write it." She looked up from the pad. Something shifted in her face, not dramatically, not the kind of shift that would read from 10 feet away, just a small recalibration. "You wrote the maintenance manual for this engine series." "Part of it? Hartwell Aerospace Propulsion Division, before the acquisition. I was on the GE certification team for the turbofan family that powers your G700 fleet." She was quiet for a moment. He watched her process that information the same way she'd processed the grid, efficiently, without visible reaction, integrating it into whatever picture she was building. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. It was a genuine question, not a hostile one. He thought about how to answer it. "Because you're going to need to decide what to do with what I'm showing you," he said, "and you can make a better decision if you understand where I'm coming from. I'm not a small-town mechanic who got lucky with a borescope. I know what I'm looking at, and what I'm looking at concerns me." She pulled up a shop stool, his spare, the one that sat by the second workbench, and sat down without asking. It was the first time he'd seen her do anything without an implicit expectation that someone would prepare the way first. "Show me," she said. So he showed her. He walked her through the grid, tail number by tail number, explaining the difference between a legitimate Category 3 closure and the kind of shortcuts the records were showing. He explained what oil carbonization on a turbine blade indicated in terms of the history of the fault, that this wasn't a new problem, that the bearing seal in his N44 VC had been degrading over time. that the conditions for that degradation had probably been present in some form across other aircraft in the fleet, if the pattern of pressure events was what he thought it was. He wasn't gentle about it, but he wasn't cruel either. He spoke the way he'd spoken in the Hartwell review sessions, directly, specifically, without editorializing more than the facts required. He'd learned that tone from Ehrlich, who had believed that technical facts were most useful when they arrived without the distortion of how the speaker felt about them. Victoria listened. She asked 3 questions, all of them specific and intelligent, and he answered them without simplifying. She wasn't someone who needed things simplified, which he appreciated more than he showed. When he finished, she sat for a moment with her eyes on the legal pad. 20 incidents, she said, 23 in total. 3 of them have proper documentation, 20 don't. And your aircraft today, N44VC, that's number 24. Yes. She pressed her fingers together in front of her mouth for a moment, thinking. Then she dropped her hands and looked at him directly. If those aircraft are flying right now, and most of them are, that's what I can't tell you with certainty, he said. I can tell you what the records show and what my inspection of this aircraft found. I can't tell you the current condition of the rest of your fleet without inspecting them. That's the problem. But your assessment is that the risk is real. He didn't hedge it. It's not a certainty. It's not a guaranteed failure on any specific aircraft. But when you have a recurring fault in the same system across a fleet, and you have evidence that the fault was addressed at the symptom level rather than the root cause level, the risk profile is not what your maintenance records say it is. And your maintenance records are what your insurance, your regulator, and your clients believe. She stood up. She walked to the hangar door and stood there for a minute with her back to him, looking at her aircraft in the afternoon light. It sat there on the ramp in all its expensive stillness, and he thought about how many times she must have looked at one of those jets and felt only what they represented, speed, reach, control, without thinking about the complexities sealed inside each nacelle. I need to make some calls, she said, to the ramp or to him or to no one in particular. There's something else, he said. She turned. He tapped the pad. The pattern of closures, the consistency of them across different maintenance stations, different crew, over 16 months. That kind of consistency doesn't happen accidentally. It happens when people are given direction, when technicians understand, explicitly or not, that certain types of faults need to move quickly through the system. He let that sit for a moment. I don't know your organization. I don't know who gave direction or how it was communicated, but I know what the records look like when people are under pressure to keep aircraft flying, and this is what those records look like. She didn't respond to that. The muscle along her jaw moved slightly. I'll be outside, she said, and walked out. Nathan looked at the legal pad for a while. Then he picked up his phone, an older model, cracked screen in the lower right corner that he'd been meaning to replace for 6 months, and scrolled to a contact he hadn't called in 2 years. Ray Kowalski had been his supervisor at Hartwell for the last 4 years of Nathan's time there. After the acquisition, Kowalski had landed at the FAA's Aircraft Certification Branch in Oklahoma City, which was either the most ironic or the most logical place for him to end up, depending on how you looked at it. They'd stayed loosely in touch. Christmas texts, the occasional forwarded article about the industry. Not close, but not gone either. Nathan dialed. It rang 4 times. Well, Kowalski said when he picked up, you're not a number I expected today. Ray, you still at the certification branch? Office with a window and everything. Why, what did you break? Nothing I broke, Nathan said. I need to talk to you about something. Might take a few minutes. A pause. Kowalski had known him long enough to read something in that phrasing. Should I close my door? Probably. He heard the sound of a door and then Kowalski settling back into what sounded like an extremely comfortable chair. All right, talk to me. Nathan talked. He laid it out the same way he'd laid it out for Victoria, the aircraft, the bore scope findings, the oil filter, the maintenance records, and the grid he'd built, and the 20 Category 3 closures that weren't. He didn't editorialize. He read from his notes. He told Kowalski the tail numbers. Kowalski was quiet for most of it. When he interrupted, it was with specific questions. What was the particulate count on the filter? What stage were the blade deposits? What was the squawk history on the 3 properly documented closures? He was writing things down. Nathan could hear the scratch of it, a man who also thought better on paper. When Nathan finished, there was a longer silence. 20 closures, Kowalski said. 20 that I can document from the records I have access to. There may be more. Fleet size? I don't know the full number. What I can see is over 40 tail numbers in this records access. Call it that plus whatever their full inventory is. And these are all G700s? Same engine family, yes. Not all 700s. Some are the 650 variant. Same engine series with a different fan stage, but the fault code maps to the same bearing housing. Kowalski made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Then, Nathan, you're aware of what you're describing. I'm aware. This isn't a write it up and send it to the operator situation. I know. But if what you're telling me is accurate, and I'm not saying it isn't, I'm saying if this is a potential airworthiness concern across an active fleet, that's a different animal. I know what it is, Ray. That's why I called you. Another silence. Outside, Nathan could hear Victoria's voice rising briefly and then dropping, the rhythm of someone managing a crisis conversation. Her flight to Tulsa was in less than 2 hours. I'm going to need your documentation, Kowalski said. Everything, the bore scope imagery, the filter report, your written findings, and whatever records you can legally give me access to. Can you have that to me tonight? I can have the primary findings to you in 3 hours. The records, those came from the operator's system. I can tell you what I saw in them. Whether I can provide copies depends on what the operator authorizes. Understood. Get me what you can. And Nathan, a pause. Don't let that aircraft fly. I wasn't planning to. Good. And don't let anyone pressure you into signing something you don't agree with. Already past that one, Nathan said. She asked. I said no. She. A beat. Is this Caldwell Aviation? Yes. Kowalski went quiet in a different way. Victoria Caldwell's personal aircraft. The woman is sitting outside my hangar right now making phone calls. He could hear Kowalski processing that. All right, he said slowly. All right, this is going to move fast once I start making notifications. You understand that? I do. And you're comfortable with that? Nathan looked at his legal pad, at the grid of dates and tail numbers, and the 20 gaps where proper documentation should have been and wasn't. Yes, he said. I'm comfortable with that. After he hung up, he sat for a moment in the particular quiet of a decision that's been made. It wasn't peaceful exactly. It was the specific stillness that comes after you've crossed a line that doesn't allow for walking back. Not a bad feeling, not a good one, just real. The kind of real that settles in your chest and stays. He picked up a fresh pen and started drafting his formal finding document. He wrote it the way Ehrlich had taught him to write them at Hartwell. First the observed conditions, then the supporting evidence, then the applicable regulatory references, then the conclusion. No opinion before fact. No conclusion before evidence. Just what was true, in the order it could be proven. He was on his third page when Victoria came back inside. She walked directly to where he was sitting, which meant she had purpose, which meant the phone calls had produced something. I spoke with my chief of maintenance operations, she said, Marcus Webb. He wants to talk to you directly. All right. She held out her phone. Webb was already on the line. Nathan had never spoken to Marcus Webb, but he knew the type within 45 seconds of the man opening his mouth. Webb had the voice of someone who had been managing up for a long time, smooth and professional, but with a current of assertion running underneath it. The voice of someone who believed that confidence presented loudly enough was a substitute for correctness. Mr. Cole, Webb said, I appreciate you flagging this, and I want to assure you that we take maintenance concerns very seriously at Caldwell Aviation. That said, I've reviewed the squawk history on N44VC, and our records indicate, your records indicate 20 Category 3 closures across the fleet without the supporting inspection documentation the manual requires, Nathan said. He kept his voice even, the way Kowalski had taught him to keep it when the room was pushing back. That's what your records indicate. A pause. I'm not sure where you're getting a number like, I built the grid from the records Captain Mercer provided access to. I can share it with you, And I want to be direct with you, Mr. Webb, because I think directness is going to save everyone a lot of time. He looked at the pad in front of him. I've already been in contact with the FAA certification branch. They're going to be reaching out to your organization. The best thing you can do right now is not make this harder than it needs to be. The silence on the other end of the line had a different quality than the ones before it. This was not the silence of someone thinking. This was the silence of someone recalculating. You contacted the FAA, Webb said. I did, about an hour ago. Victoria was watching Nathan with an expression he couldn't read. She was very still. I see, Webb said. His voice had changed slightly, the smooth, professional current still there, but the assertive undertone was quieter now, recalibrated. I'll need to review the documentation you're referring to. I'll have my formal findings to you by end of day. I'd recommend you have your legal and compliance teams available, he paused. And Mr. Webb, N44VC doesn't fly until this is resolved. I want that to be clear. Mr. Cole, the authorization to ground an aircraft is mine, Nathan said. When it's on my ramp and my inspection has found it unairworthy. Yes. He let that settle. Have a good afternoon. He handed the phone back to Victoria. She took it without a word, looked at the screen for a moment, and then put it in her pocket. The hangar was very quiet for about 10 seconds. You called the FAA, she said. Not an accusation, just a statement, said in a tone that was working out what it meant. Yes. Before you talked to me. While you were on your phone calls. Yes. He met her eyes. The condition of your aircraft and the pattern in your records, that's not something I could sit on and wait to see how a conversation went. If I'm wrong about the seriousness of it, the FAA review will say so. If you're right, you've just grounded my company, she said quietly. He didn't answer that, because it wasn't wrong. It was, in fact, exactly correct. And she knew it. She was standing there with the particular posture of someone who is used to being the person that things happen to other people at, and was adjusting, in real time, to a different position in the world. Your car goes to Tulsa whenever you're ready, he said. I'll have my formal documentation done before you land in New York. She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming through the west-facing panels in the hangar wall now, angling across the floor in long rectangles, the kind of light that makes familiar things look slightly strange. You helped write the manual, she said. Not a question. Yes. And you're sure about what you found? Yes. She nodded once, slowly. Then she turned and walked toward the hangar door. She stopped just at the threshold, the late sun hitting her from the side, and she turned back. How many passengers do we carry a day? She asked. Across the fleet? Nathan looked at her. I don't know your operation well enough to give you a number. About 1,400, she said, give or take. She held his gaze for a moment. Just so you know what you were looking at when you looked at that grid. She walked out into the light. He listened to her footsteps on the concrete, and then the sound of a car door, and then an engine turning over and tires on the access road. He picked up his pen and kept writing. Ray Kowalski moved faster than Nathan had expected, which meant Kowalski had taken one look at the documentation and understood immediately that this was not a situation that rewarded deliberation. Nathan's formal findings had gone out at 7:40 that evening, emailed to Kowalski's FAA address, and copied to the certification branch's general intake, the way Kowalski had instructed. 38 pages including the borescope imagery, the oil filter particulate analysis, his written inspection narrative, and the grid. He'd also included a technical memo, 4 pages, single-spaced, walking through the maintenance manual's Category 3 closure requirements and mapping each of the 20 underdocumented Caldwell aviation incidents against those requirements, showing specifically and without ambiguity what documentation was missing from each one and what physical inspection steps the manual required before that closure category could be applied. He'd written technical memos before. He knew how to write them so that a regulator could follow the argument without needing to be an engine specialist. He knew where to define terms and where not to, when to cite chapter and verse from the manual, and when to let the evidence speak for itself. Ehrlich had reviewed his first 3 memos at Hartwell and handed them back with marks in the margins, and the observation that technical writing was not about demonstrating knowledge, it was about transferring it. Nathan had never forgotten that. Kowalski called him at 10:15 that night. Nathan was still at the hangar. He told himself he was staying to finish some calibration work on the fuel flow valve he'd set down that morning, and there was truth in that. But there was also the other thing, the awareness that something was in motion now, and sleep was going to be difficult regardless of where he was. He'd sent his daughter a text at 9 saying he'd be home late and not to wait up. She was 19, studying engineering at a state school 2 hours north, home for the summer and working a counter job at the diner in town. She'd replied with a thumbs up and a separate message that said there was leftover pasta in the fridge, which was her version of taking care of him. "I reviewed your memo," Kowalski said, without preamble. That was Kowalski's way. Nathan had always appreciated it. Twice. And I spent the last 2 hours on the phone with our airworthiness division and our general counsel. A pause that had weight in it. "We're issuing an emergency airworthiness directive, applicable to all Caldwell Aviation aircraft operating the GE-derived TF-77 engine series. Mandatory ground inspection before return to service." Nathan sat down on his shop stool. He'd been standing without realizing it. "How many aircraft is that?" he asked, though he had a rough sense of the answer already. "Fleet-wide, across all Caldwell Aviation operators and subsidiaries, our current registry count is 314 aircraft. Some of those will already be on the ground for scheduled maintenance. Active right now." Kowalski paused again, and Nathan could hear paper moving. "Around 240. 240 aircraft." Nathan looked at the west wall of his hangar, where the afternoon light had been, and where now there was just dark beyond the panels. "When does it go out?" he asked. "It's being drafted tonight. It goes out at 6 a.m. tomorrow through the standard notification chain, every operator, every maintenance station, every relevant repair facility." Another pause. "It'll hit the wires pretty quick after that. This isn't going to stay quiet." "I didn't expect it to." "No." Kowalski's voice was careful now, the way it got when he was thinking about the downstream. "Nathan, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it straight." "Okay." "Your documentation is solid. The memo is clean. I've got nothing in front of me that looks anything other than exactly what you said it was." A beat. "Is there anything I should know that isn't in the documentation? Anything about how you access the records? Anything about conversations that happened today that might complicate how this looks?" Nathan understood the question. Kowalski was checking the foundation before he built on it. The records were provided by the aircraft's captain, voluntarily, as part of standard maintenance coordination, Nathan said. "Victoria Caldwell was present when I discussed my findings and was shown the grid I built. She did not ask me to suppress anything. When I told her I'd already contacted you, she was surprised. She didn't obstruct." He thought about her standing in the doorway, the afternoon light. 1,400 passengers a day. "She asked me how many passengers the fleet carries." Kowalski absorbed that. "And the operator's maintenance chief, Webb, tried to push backed off when I told him the FAA was already in the loop. Nothing I'd characterize as obstruction, but the pushback before he knew about the FAA call was notable." Noted. Kowalski sounded like he was writing that down. "All right. I'll be in touch after the directive goes out. Expect calls from our airworthiness team. They'll want a recorded interview about your inspection process. Standard practice." "I know. Fine." "And Nathan," a different tone now, "the official business set aside. You did the right thing. I just want to say that plainly." "I found what I found," Nathan said. "That's all." After the call, he sat in the quiet hangar for a long time. 44 VC was still outside on the ramp, lit by the single sodium lamp mounted on the hangar's exterior wall. It looked strange out there alone. Aircraft that size were built for movement, built for altitude, and sitting still on a rural ramp at night, they had the quality of something out of its natural element. Patient, slightly unreal. He thought about 240 aircraft. He thought about what Kowalski had said, "It'll hit the wires pretty quick," and he knew what that meant. By morning, this would not be a story about a mechanic in a rural hangar. It would be something else. He wasn't sure exactly what, but something else. He packed up his tools and drove home. The directive went out at 6:03 a.m., and by 6:45 it had reached Caldwell Aviation's Operations Center in Midtown Manhattan, where a night shift coordinator named Terrence had been managing routine repositioning flights and was now staring at his screen with the specific expression of a person who has received information that cannot be a mistake but desperately wishes it could be. By 7:10, Marcus Webb was in the Operations Center in yesterday's suit, having been called from his apartment and having arrived without having had time to do much about his appearance, which was itself a statement about how seriously he was taking the next 15 minutes. By 7:30, Victoria Caldwell was on a call from her apartment on the Upper East Side, having not slept more than 3 hours, wearing the kind of composed expression that had to be constructed deliberately at that hour and under those circumstances. Nathan knew none of this in real time. What he knew was that when he got to the hangar at 6:20 and made coffee and turned on the small desk radio he kept for company during long calibration sessions, the 7 a.m. business news led with it. The FAA this morning issuing an emergency airworthiness directive affecting the entire Caldwell Aviation private jet fleet. The directive, covering aircraft equipped with the TF-77 turbofan engine series, requires mandatory ground inspection before any aircraft can return to service. Caldwell Aviation operates one of the largest private aviation fleets in North America, serving high-net-worth clients across. He turned the radio off. He didn't need to hear the rest of it. He knew the rest of it. His phone started ringing at 7:12. He didn't recognize the first number. He let it go to voicemail. It was a journalist from an aviation trade publication, which he'd expected. 3 more calls in the next 40 minutes, 2 more publications, and one that turned out to be a wrong number. He didn't call any of them back. He had nothing to say to journalists that wasn't already in his documentation, and his documentation was the FAA's to handle. At 8:50, his daughter called. "Dad?" Ella's voice had that particular frequency that meant she'd seen something that made her think of him. "Are you watching the news?" "I heard the radio. I'm fine." "The news is saying they're saying 300 planes are grounded." "Around that, yeah." A pause. Is this you?" He picked up the coffee mug. "I found a problem with an aircraft yesterday. I reported it. The FAA made the call about the rest." "Dad." "Ella, that's not, you can't just say it like that, like it's nothing." "It's not nothing. It's also not, I just did what the job required." He looked at the legal pad on his workbench, the grid of numbers in his own handwriting. "Are you working today?" "I'm off till noon." A pause. "Are you going to be okay? Because the news is making it sound like they keep saying Caldwell Aviation, and they're interviewing people, and one guy on cable said this could be worth billions in damages, and I'll be fine," he said. "I'm at the hangar. Come by if you want lunch." She showed up at 11:45 with sandwiches from the diner and sat on his spare stool and watched him work on the fuel flow valve he'd been trying to get to since yesterday morning. She didn't push him on it. She was good that way. She'd gotten that from him, or maybe from the years of watching him work through things in silence. But either way, she understood that he talked when he was ready, and not before. "How's the engineering program?" he said, around noon. "Hard," she said. "Good hard, but hard. We had a materials lab last week where we had to..." She launched into it, the particular energy of someone who is genuinely engaged with what they're learning, and he listened and asked questions, and they ate their sandwiches, and for about an hour the hangar was just a hangar again. She left at 1:30. He watched her truck go down the access road and felt the specific kind of gratitude that didn't need to be said out loud. His phone rang at 2:07. He looked at the screen. Victoria Caldwell's number. He'd stored it when Mercer gave it to him the day before. Standard practice when you had an aircraft on your ramp and the owner's contact number in hand. He answered it. "Mr. Cole." Her voice was different from yesterday. Still controlled, but with something underneath it that hadn't been there before. Or maybe had been there, and he hadn't recognized it. A kind of rawness, sandpapered down to professional smoothness, but not entirely gone. "Ms. Caldwell, I've been with my legal team and my board since 6 this morning." A pause. I wanted to call you personally. He waited. I owe you an apology, she said, for yesterday, when I arrived, the comment I made about your facility. He hadn't expected that. He was quiet for a moment, recalibrating. You don't have to. I do, actually. I say a lot of things I don't think about hard enough because I'm moving fast. That was one of them. A breath. It was dismissive and it was wrong. And given what happened in the next 8 hours, it was also a pause that had a complicated shape to it. Embarrassing is not the right word. Let me say it was clarifying. I appreciate that, he said. And he meant it, mostly, though appreciation and absolution weren't the same thing, and he didn't offer the second one because it wasn't really his to give. The FAA has been in contact with our operations center. We have representatives from their airworthiness division coming in tomorrow. She paused. The clients are... It's been a difficult morning. He could only imagine. 300 private aircraft, many of them under charter arrangements with clients whose definition of inconvenience was a flight attendant who ran out of their preferred sparkling water. An emergency grounding directive was not going to land quietly in that world. I imagine so, he said. Marcus Webb has been managing communications. A slight change in her voice on the word managing. He's been characterizing the directive as a precautionary measure, saying the FAA response is broader than the actual risk profile. Nathan didn't say anything to that. I told him this morning to stop doing that, she said. I told him I wanted accurate communication with clients. That was a conversation. Another pause. He pushed back. What did he say? He said that my decision to give a rural mechanic access to our full fleet records was, his word was reckless. Her voice was flat now, the way voices get when the speaker is working hard to keep them from becoming something else. He said the directive was the result of an incomplete analysis by someone without current industry standing. Nathan looked at the wall for a moment. And what did you tell him? I told him that the mechanic in question helped write the maintenance manual for our engine series, and that if he wanted to have a substantive conversation about the technical analysis, he should probably wait until he'd read it. A beat. He asked how I knew that. What did you say? I said the mechanic told me. And then I asked Marcus why our maintenance record showed 20 Category 3 closures without supporting documentation, and whether he'd like to explain that to me before or after the FAA asked the same question. The hangar was quiet. Through the panels, Nathan could hear the wind picking up outside, the way it did in the afternoon in this part of the country, coming across flat ground without anything to break it. How did that go, he asked. He's getting legal counsel, she said, which tells me most of what I need to know. Nathan turned the fuel flow valve over in his hands without looking at it. Ms. Caldwell, the pattern in your records, the consistency of those closures across 16 months, across different stations, different crew, that doesn't happen because a few technicians got lazy. It happens because of the environment those technicians were working in. I know, she said, quietly. That environment came from somewhere. I know. The same quiet, heavier now. I'm not saying it came from you specifically. I don't know your organization well enough to say that, but someone set a tone, and the tone said that faults needed to move quickly through the system, that schedules took priority, that return to service mattered more than... I understand what I'm responsible for, she said. Her voice had an edge now, not anger at him, but the edge of someone pressing a bruise to confirm it's real. I built that company. The culture in that company belongs to me whether I knew what it was or not. He didn't argue with that because she was right. They were quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that doesn't need filling. What happens now? She asked. From your end. The FAA airworthiness team will want a recorded interview about my inspection process, probably this week. After that, my formal role in this is finished. They take it from here. An N44 VC needs to go to an authorized repair facility. I wasn't overstating what I found. The bearing seal, the blade deposits, those need a proper shop, proper equipment, full teardown. He paused. I can give you my written recommendation for the Atlanta facility if you haven't already made arrangements. Send it to Priya's email. She'll coordinate. A pause. Thank you for that. He nodded, which she couldn't see. One more thing, she said. The FAA Airworthiness Director, a woman named Castillo, she mentioned your name when she called this morning. She knew who you were. She said, Victoria paused as though choosing words carefully. She said she wished you'd come back to the industry. Nathan looked around his hangar, at the old equipment with its calibration certificates taped to the side, at the legal pad on the workbench with the grid of numbers, at the windsock visible through the open door, turning in the afternoon wind. I am in the industry, he said. Victoria was quiet for a moment. I suppose you are, she said. Chat. The next 72 hours moved in a way that Nathan experienced mostly from a distance, the way you experience weather, aware of it, affected by it in small ways, but not inside it. The story broke into mainstream news by Tuesday morning, which was when the financial press picked it up and the numbers got attached to it. 312 aircraft grounded, approximately 1,400 daily passenger movements interrupted, Caldwell Aviation's stock price dropping 11% in the first hour of trading before the markets got rational about it. Client lists were not public, but the speculation industry, which in the private aviation world was robust and surprisingly well-informed, produced names that made the story interesting to a broader audience than it might otherwise have reached. Nathan did his FAA interview on Wednesday at the Regional Flight Standards District office in Oklahoma City. He drove up in the F-250 and parked in a lot that was mostly government sedans and one very optimistic food truck, and he sat in a conference room with two airworthiness inspectors and a woman named Castillo, who turned out to be the same FAA airworthiness director who'd told Victoria that she wished Nathan had come back to the industry. Castillo was in her mid-50s, compact and precise, with the kind of attention that felt like a physical thing in the room. She'd clearly read his documentation in detail. She asked questions that went 3 and 4 levels deep into the technical analysis, and when he answered, she didn't nod along the way people do when they're waiting for you to stop talking. She actually listened. It was, he realized, the first time in quite a while that he'd been in a room with someone who understood the specifics of what he was describing at the same level he did. They went through the borescope findings for 90 minutes, then the oil filter analysis, then the maintenance manual citation structure in his memo, which Castillo had printed out and annotated in 3 different colors of pen. He answered everything directly. He didn't soften the parts about the 20 underdocumented closures, and he didn't editorialize about what those closures meant in terms of organizational culture. He'd said what he had to say about that to Victoria, and it wasn't his job to make the FAA's case for them. His job was to tell them what he'd found and how he'd found it. The interpretation was theirs. At the end, one of the inspectors, a younger man named Dressler, who'd been taking notes with the focused urgency of someone who wanted to get everything right, looked up and said, "Can I ask you something off the record?" Castillo said, "Dressler." "Right, sorry." He went back to his notes. Then, after a moment, he looked up again. "Is it really called the Ehrlich method, the way you structured the borescope documentation?" Nathan looked at him. "It's not called anything officially. It's just how a man I worked for taught me to write an inspection report." "It's very clean," Dressler said. "The logic is very clean." He was a particular kind of teacher, Nathan said, the kind that cares more about whether you understand than whether you're impressed. He drove back to Harlan County in the late afternoon, the sun at his back the whole way, the flat land running out in front of him to the east. By Thursday, the scope of the inspections was coming into focus in a way that wasn't comfortable for anyone. The FAA's own preliminary review of Caldwell Aviation's maintenance records, now fully subpoenaed, not just the portion Mercer had provided, extended the count of underdocumented Category 3 closures from 20 to 31. 3 additional aircraft were found during ground inspection to have oil filter particulate counts above the return-to-service limit. 2 of them had been in regular service the week before. One had made 4 transatlantic crossings in the past month. That last number, 4 transatlantic crossings, got into the press on Friday, and it was the number that turned the story from an industry story into something broader. Because 4 transatlantic crossings was not an abstraction. 4 transatlantic crossings was people. Passengers who had boarded a flight in good faith, trusting a maintenance system that had been, for 16 months, quietly substituting documentation for inspection. Nathan's phone did not stop that week. He let most calls go to voicemail. He returned the ones from Kowalski and Castillo. He returned one from an attorney he'd never heard of before, who turned out to represent 3 Caldwell Aviation clients asking about the inspection timeline for their specific aircraft. And he told the attorney politely that he had no information about specific aircraft beyond N44VC and directed him to the FAA's public notice line. He did not return the calls from journalists, which now numbered in the double digits and included 2 requests from television producers that Ella found inexplicably exciting when he mentioned them at dinner Friday night. "You could do it," she said. "You'd be good on camera." "I would be terrible on camera." "You'd be boring on camera, which is different. Boring is good. Boring means credible." He looked at her across the kitchen table. She had grease on her wrist from the diner's exhaust fan, which she'd apparently fixed on her shift because the regular maintenance person hadn't shown up. She noticed him looking at it and rubbed at it with a dish towel. "You fixed their exhaust fan," he said. "It was making a noise." "You're a paying customer who works a counter shift there." "Dad, it was making a noise." She looked at him with the particular expression that was entirely her own and somehow also entirely his. Some things just need to be fixed. He picked up his fork and said nothing, because there wasn't anything to say to that. On Saturday morning, he was at the hangar by 6:30, same as always. The sodium lamp had burned out overnight, and he'd need to get a replacement at the farm supply store. The windsock hung loose in the still morning air. N44VC sat on the ramp, going nowhere, as it had all week. He unlocked the hangar and went inside and started the coffee. He pulled the fuel flow valve out of its drawer because he was going to finish the calibration today regardless of what else happened. He spread his tools on the workbench and turned on the desk radio, and then turned it off again and worked in silence instead. He thought about Marcus Webb, who had retained counsel and was, according to the brief and carefully worded update Victoria had sent through Priya on Thursday, no longer in an operational role at Caldwell Aviation. He thought about 31 underdocumented closures and 4 transatlantic crossings, and the texture of those months in which someone had been telling technicians, not in writing probably, because people who do this kind of thing rarely do it in writing, that the numbers needed to move, that the birds needed to fly, that the squawks needed to close. He thought about what Kowalski had said to him the morning after the directive went out, when they'd talked briefly at 7 a.m. before Kowalski walked into what he'd described only as a very long day. Kowalski had said, "The system worked this time." And Nathan had said, "It shouldn't have needed to." And Kowalski had said, "No, it shouldn't have." The coffee finished brewing. He poured a cup and sat down and picked up the valve and got back to work. Outside, the morning light was coming across the flat country in long, clean lines. The kind of morning that didn't know or care about the week that had just passed. The kind that arrived the same way it had the morning before. Steady, indifferent, full of the particular silence of a place where the land runs all the way to the horizon and the sky runs all the way back. The windsock stirred. Somewhere, a long way off, an aircraft was making its approach. The call Victoria made to Nathan on the following Tuesday was not the kind of call she'd planned to make. She'd planned, in the vague and optimistic way of someone managing too many simultaneous crises, to keep Nathan Cole at arm's length from this point forward, to process his documentation through the appropriate channels, let the FAA handle its investigation, and manage the fallout through her legal and communications teams, the way she managed every other institutional crisis that had come at her over 20 years of building something large enough to break in interesting ways. That plan lasted until Monday afternoon, when the FAA's preliminary investigation report landed in her legal team's inbox, and she read it in one sitting at her desk, with the door closed and her assistant holding all calls and the particular stillness of someone receiving information that reorganizes the room around them. The report ran 63 pages. She read all of it. What the FAA had found, working from the fully subpoenaed maintenance records and initial interviews with Caldwell Aviation's maintenance staff, was more organized than negligence. Negligence was what happened when systems failed because people stopped paying attention. What happened at Caldwell Aviation had a different shape. It was what happened when a system was quietly, consistently, never quite explicitly pressured to produce a particular kind of output. And then the people inside that system did what people inside systems generally do, which was adapt. The report traced the pressure to a directive that Marcus Webb had issued 14 months ago. Not in writing, not officially, but through a series of operations meetings and maintenance coordinator calls and the particular language that managers used when they wanted outcomes without accountability. Webb had introduced what he called an efficiency benchmark for maintenance squawk resolution, a target time measured in hours, from fault flag to return to service authorization. The benchmark was not a policy. It was not in any document. It existed in the way that organizational culture exists, in what got praised and what got questioned, in who got promoted and who got sideways looks in the hallway, in the aggregate of small signals that told technicians and coordinators what the operation valued and how much. The Category 3 closure, the sensor check and return to service shortcut, was not something Webb had instructed anyone to use. But it was the fastest path from flag to authorization, and fast was what the benchmark rewarded, and so it propagated through the maintenance network the way these things propagate, without a memo, without a meeting, through the invisible channels of a culture that had learned what it needed to learn to function inside its own incentive structure. 31 closures in 16 months, 11 maintenance stations across 4 countries, dozens of individual technicians, none of whom had, as far as the report could determine, any individual intent to compromise safety, all of whom had been operating inside a system that made the shortcut feel like the reasonable choice. Victoria read all of it, and then she sat at her desk for a while looking at nothing, and then she called Nathan Cole. He answered on the 3rd ring. She could hear ambient sound that she'd started to associate with him, the low hum of something mechanical, the quality of a large enclosed space. "Ms. Caldwell," he said. "I've read the preliminary report," she said, "the full FAA document." "Okay. I want you to come to New York." She'd meant to frame it differently, more as a request, less as a statement, but it came out the way things came out when she was tired and past the point of constructing softened versions of what she meant. "I want you to sit in a room with me and my remaining operations leadership and help me understand what a proper maintenance culture looks like, from the inside, not from a consultant's slide deck." A pause. "I'm not a consultant." "I know you're not. That's why I'm calling you instead of one of the 17 consultants my board has already suggested." Another pause. She waited. She was getting better at waiting for him, she noticed. It was not a skill she'd previously had much use for. "What would that involve specifically?" he asked. "A day? Maybe 2? I want you to look at how we've structured our maintenance operations, the reporting chains, the authorization protocols, the performance metrics Webb put in place, and tell me where the problems are, not just the technical problems, the structural ones." She paused. "I've got the FAA telling me what went wrong. I need someone to tell me how to make sure it can't go wrong the same way again." "That's a bigger ask than a day or 2. "I know, but a day or 2 is where I need to start." A beat. "I'll cover your travel and your time at whatever rate you set. I'm not asking for charity." He was quiet again. She'd noticed that his silences weren't uncomfortable the way most people's silences were in a business context. They didn't have the quality of someone buying time or managing their response. They had the quality of someone actually thinking. "I'll need to arrange coverage for the hangar," he said. "Give me a few days." "Thursday?" she said. "Thursday works." She wrote it down. "I'll have Priya send details." "One thing," he said. "Yes. I'll tell you what I think. All of it. Not a version of it calibrated to what's useful for communications or litigation. If that's not..." "That's exactly what I want," she said. And she meant it, which surprised her slightly, because there was a version of herself from 18 months ago who would have wanted the calibrated version, the version that could be managed. "That's the only version I'm interested in." Nathan flew into LaGuardia on Thursday morning on a regional carrier that had seen better decades, sitting in a middle seat between a man who fell asleep on his shoulder before they'd cleared Oklahoma and a woman who spent the entire flight doing something on her laptop that involved a lot of aggressive typing. He'd brought his laptop and the legal pad, and he spent most of the flight reviewing notes he'd made about what he wanted to say. He hadn't been to New York in 11 years. He'd been based there for 2 years during the Hartwell certification work, when the FAA's New York office had been a regular destination, and he'd known the PATH train schedule better than the bus routes in his own hometown. He remembered the city the way you remember places where you were busy and young and not yet aware of how quickly the particular texture of that time would become unretrievable. Priya had arranged a car. The driver was a quiet man who took the Van Wyck without being asked, which Nathan appreciated. He watched the city come up around him, not with nostalgia exactly, more with the detached interest of someone returning to a place that had gone on without them and not appeared to suffer for it. The Caldwell Aviation headquarters occupied 11 floors of a building in Midtown that had the kind of lobby designed to communicate, in the first 30 seconds, that the people who worked here operated at a level you might not. Dark stone, sculptural light fixtures, a reception desk that was the approximate size of Nathan's entire hangar. He stood at it in his good jacket, charcoal wool, the one he wore to the FAA meetings, and gave his name, and the receptionist smiled with professional warmth and called upstairs. Victoria met him at the elevator on the 14th floor. She looked different than she had at the hangar, not in a surface way, but in something underneath. She still wore the composure like a second layer of skin, but there were stress fractures in it that the afternoon light at Harlan County hadn't been there to reveal. She looked like someone who had been sleeping badly for 10 days and was managing it through will and decent concealer. "Thank you for coming," she said, and shook his hand with the directness he remembered. "Of course." She walked him through the floor. It was quieter than it should have been for an 11-floor operation midweek. People at desks, yes, but with the subdued quality of a workplace that had absorbed something significant and was still in the process of integrating it. A few people looked up as he passed. He didn't know if they knew who he was or if they were just looking because Victoria was moving through the space with purpose, and people tended to track that. The conference room she took him to had windows that looked north over the city. There were 5 people already seated. A woman introduced as Helena Dross, the acting head of maintenance operations replacing Webb, a man named Sue, who ran flight operations, a compliance director named Patricia Ames, who had the focused expression of someone who had not slept in longer than Victoria, a senior attorney named Briggs, who had the particular stillness of someone present to observe and limit in that order, and on a video screen mounted at the far end of the table, Kowalski. Nathan hadn't known Kowalski would be there. He caught the older man's eye on the screen, and Kowalski gave him the small nod of someone who has arranged something and is checking that it landed correctly. "Ray," Nathan said. "Nathan, nice jacket. You look exactly the same." "I look terrible," Kowalski said pleasantly. "I've been in depositions for 3 days. Let's get started." So, they went for 4 hours without a real break. Nathan had brought his notes, but he didn't use them much. The conversation moved in directions that notes couldn't entirely anticipate, which was fine, because the things that couldn't be anticipated were usually the things worth saying. He started with the maintenance manual, not as a document but as a philosophy, what the Category 3 closure was designed for, what the inspection protocol it bypassed was designed to find, and why the distinction between those two things mattered in a way that wasn't obvious until you were looking at it from inside an engine. Helena Dross asked most of the early questions. She was thorough and specific and had the quality of someone who had spent the last 10 days absorbing an enormous amount of information she wished she'd had access to earlier. She'd been the deputy under Webb, and Nathan could see her working through the dual burden of that, trying to understand the failure honestly while also carrying the weight of having been adjacent to it without seeing it clearly. "The efficiency benchmark Webb put in place," she said. "Our team has been trying to understand how that propagated. Because we've interviewed 12 technicians now, and none of them can point to a specific instruction they received. They just knew." "That's how it works," Nathan said. "You don't need a memo. You need a culture." "But how does a culture produce that kind of consistency?" 31 incidents, 11 stations. Because the technicians weren't making individual decisions. They were reading the environment and making rational choices inside it. He leaned forward slightly. "If you're a maintenance tech and your supervisor's supervisor has a benchmark that rewards fast closures, and you know, even if nobody said it directly, that the aircraft that generate your company's revenue need to fly, and you have a legitimate closure option available to you that doesn't require a 3-hour physical inspection, you're going to look at that option. Not because you're lazy or reckless, because you're a human being operating inside a system, and the system has told you, in 100 small ways, what it values." "And the 3 who did it right," Sue said. "The 3 closures with full documentation. Why were those different?" "I don't know for certain. Could be those technicians had more experience with the engine series and were less willing to take the shortcut. Could be they happened to have the time and the equipment. Could be they'd worked at organizations before where a senior person had made the documentation requirements non-negotiable, so it was built into how they worked regardless of what the surrounding culture said. He paused. People carry their training with them. Good training stays with you even when the environment around you is pointing the other way. That's why training matters, not for the easy cases, but for the pressure cases. Ames, the compliance director, had been quiet for most of the first hour. She looked up from her notes. The performance benchmark. Webb put it in place 14 months ago. You're saying the closures started around the same time. The earliest one in the records I reviewed was 16 months ago. The benchmark, based on what the FAA report says, went into place 14 months ago. He paused. The 2 months before the benchmark are worth looking at. There might be a learning curve, technicians testing what the new expectations were before the shortcut became normalized. Ames wrote something down. Briggs, the attorney, shifted slightly in his chair but said nothing. Victoria had been mostly quiet. She was at the head of the table and she was listening with the kind of attention that felt like it had a physical weight. Not passive, not neutral, but fully engaged in a way that didn't express itself as participation. He'd noticed she was like that in the hangar too. She gathered, she processed, she spoke when she had something to say that was worth the words. The metrics, she said now. We use performance metrics across every division. It's how we manage at scale. Are you saying that's the problem? I'm saying metrics measure what they measure, Nathan said. An efficiency benchmark on squawk resolution time measures resolution time. It does not measure whether the resolution was correct. If the only signal your technicians are getting about their performance is how fast they close squawks, then over time, fast closure becomes the goal. And the quality of what's behind the closure drifts because it's not what's being measured. He looked at her. What gets measured is what gets managed. The question is whether you're measuring the right things. So what should we be measuring? Helena asked. Root cause identification rate. How often is a fault properly traced to its source versus closed at the symptom level? Resquawk rate. How often does a closed fault reappear within a defined period, which is your best proxy for whether the closure was real? Physical inspection completion rate. See it against protocol requirements. He paused. And you need a reporting mechanism where technicians can flag pressure without consequence. An anonymous reporting channel or a direct line to whoever your independent safety officer is, which you should have and currently don't. We have a safety committee, Ames said. Who does the safety committee report to? A pause. Operations leadership. Who reported to Webb? Nathan said. Not accusatory, just a fact placed on the table. Ames looked at her notes. Yes. A safety function that reports through the same chain as operations is not independent. It's part of operations. It will behave the way operations behaves, prioritize what operations prioritizes, and under pressure, it will fold in the direction that operations folds. For the function to work, it needs a reporting line that goes around operations, directly to the board or to an external body. Otherwise, you have a structure that looks like oversight but isn't. The room was quiet for a moment. Kowalski on the screen had his chin resting on his hand and was looking at Nathan with an expression that was hard to read. Not quite pride, more like recognition. Victoria spoke. We have a board meeting in 3 weeks. I want to propose an independent safety oversight structure before then. She looked at Nathan. I'd like your input on what that should look like. In writing, if you're willing. I can do that. Briggs cleared his throat. Nathan looked at him. The attorney had been a contained presence all morning. Present, watchful, careful. Mr. Cole, Briggs said, I want to be transparent about something. The board has been discussing the possibility of a formal advisory role. Compensated, defined scope, time limited. The purpose would be to support the operational restructuring and provide technical credibility to the compliance process. A careful pause. That conversation is separate from today, but I wanted you to be aware it's occurring. Nathan looked at Victoria. She met his eyes with an expression that was for once entirely legible. She had not told Briggs to say this, and she was watching to see how Nathan took it. I appreciate the transparency, Nathan said to Briggs. I don't have a response to it right now. Today I'm here to answer questions. Briggs nodded. The subject moved on. So, they broke for lunch at 1:30. Sandwiches brought in, eaten at the conference table because Victoria said they couldn't afford to lose the time, and nobody disagreed. Nathan ate half of his sandwich and spent the other half of the break at the window, looking north over the city. Kowalski's screen had gone dark during the break. He reappeared at 1:55 with what appeared to be a different tie, which Nathan thought was worth noting but decided not to note. The afternoon session went deeper. Helena walked him through the current authorization chain for maintenance closures, station by station, and he identified 4 places where the chain had single points of failure. One person with authority to close a squawk, no required second sign-off, no automated flag for closures that fell below the protocol completion threshold. He explained what a dual authorization system looked like and how it had been implemented at Hartwell for Class 2 and above faults. Sue walked him through the scheduling system, and he spent 40 minutes on the relationship between scheduling pressure and maintenance outcomes. Not a lecture, more of a technical dialogue, 2 people mapping the same territory from different angles. Sue had been with Caldwell Aviation for 9 years and knew its operational rhythms better than anyone else in the room. He was also, Nathan thought, someone who had been aware for some time that the pressure was real without having had a clear way to say so. At one point, Sue said, quietly, not quite looking up from his notes, "The thing about Webb's benchmark, I had a feeling it was going to create problems somewhere. I didn't know where." "Did you say something to Webb?" Nathan asked. "Once, early on. He said it was an efficiency initiative and that we had the highest maintenance standards in private aviation, and this was about execution, not standards." Nathan nodded. "And you accepted that?" Sue looked up. "I did." "That's the other piece," Nathan said to the room as much as to Sue. "A culture that suppresses concern doesn't just suppress it through punishment. It suppresses it by providing plausible alternatives. You had a concern, and Webb gave you a frame that made the concern seem less valid. And you were busy, and it wasn't your direct area, and the alternative frame was reasonable enough that you could accept it without feeling like you were doing something wrong." He paused. "That's how it works. Nobody in this situation, except possibly Webb, was doing something they experienced as wrong. They were doing things that felt like the path of least resistance inside a system that had been shaped to make the wrong path feel like the reasonable one." Victoria had been watching him. "You've thought about this a lot," she said. "I've seen versions of it before." "At Hartwell?" He held her gaze. "Different circumstances, but yes. Organizational pressure on technical judgment is not a new problem." He paused. "It's always the same shape. It's the specific details that change." At 4:15 they stopped. The compliance work would continue. There were processes to redesign and documents to draft and FAA requirements to satisfy. But the day had produced what it needed to produce. Nathan could see it in the room. Not resolution, but clarity. The particular quality of a group of people who have looked at something directly and can now begin to work with what they've seen rather than around it. Helena said she'd have a draft restructuring proposal for the maintenance authorization chain within the week. Ames said the same about the safety committee reporting structure. Kowalski said he'd be available for a follow-up call after the FAA's formal findings were issued, which was expected in approximately 3 weeks. As people gathered their things, Victoria walked to Nathan's end of the table. "Thank you," she said, "for today. It was a useful conversation." She looked at him for a moment with the particular expression he'd seen first in his hangar when she'd looked at N44VC in the afternoon light. Something behind the composure. Something that was working on a problem that wasn't finished yet. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "When you were at Hartwell, you said you'd seen versions of this before, did you?" She paused. "Did you say something when you saw it?" He considered the question honestly. "Not as clearly as I should have. I raised it in a review meeting, and it got absorbed into the agenda and moved on. I let it move on." He looked at his hands for a moment. "I was 37, and I thought the company was solid, and I had other things I was managing, so I let it move on." A pause. "And then the acquisition happened, and it became someone else's problem to deal with or not deal with, and I left. Do you regret that?" He thought about Ella's face across the kitchen table. about the exhaust fan she'd fixed because it was making a noise, about the fuel flow valve he'd been calibrating all week. "I regret that I didn't say it louder," he said. "Yeah." She nodded slowly. "I regret that I built a company where the loudest voice about a safety concern had to be someone we'd never met, from a hangar at the edge of a field nobody's heard of." Her voice was even, but not easy. "I built something and I stopped looking at it clearly. I looked at the numbers and the growth and the client satisfaction scores, and I stopped asking what was underneath them." "You're asking now," he said. "I'm asking now because you forced the question," she said. "There's a difference." He didn't argue with that either, because she was right again. And he was finding that one of the more interesting things about Victoria Caldwell was that she didn't give herself easier versions of the truth than the situation called for. "The board proposal," he said. "The advisory role Briggs mentioned." She waited. "I'll think about it," he said. "Genuinely. I'm not saying no." Something shifted in her face. Not relief exactly. More like the small release of a tension she'd been holding. "That's enough for now," she said. He flew back to Harlan County on Friday morning, the same regional carrier, different middle seat. The man to his left was awake this time and wanted to talk about the weather patterns over the Midwest, which Nathan found he didn't mind as much as he might have expected. He was back at the hangar by noon. The replacement sodium lamp he'd ordered had arrived and was sitting in a box by the door, and he'd been meaning to swap it in for a week. He pulled on his work gloves and got the ladder from the back and spent 45 minutes on the exterior wall of the hangar replacing the lamp while the flat country ran out in every direction under a clear December sky. When he climbed down, the new lamp was installed and the old one was in the box, and his shoulders ached slightly from the angle, which was a thing that had started happening when he turned 45, and that he'd accepted with more equanimity than he expected. He went inside and made coffee and sat at his workbench and opened his laptop and started drafting the independent safety oversight document Victoria had asked for. He wrote for 2 hours. It was careful work. He wanted the language to be specific enough to be actionable and broad enough to survive the particular way organizations had of implementing the letter of a recommendation while defeating its spirit. He'd seen that done too. He cited 2 FAA precedents and 1 NTSB recommendation report and 3 structures from other industries where independent safety functions had been implemented effectively. He kept the draft to 12 pages because longer was not always better, and he'd learned from Ehrlich that a recommendation document was most useful at the length that people would actually read it all the way through. When he finished, he saved it and closed the laptop and sat for a while with his coffee, which had gone cold again because he kept forgetting to drink it while he was working. Outside, the windsock was moving in a steady southwest breeze. The afternoon light was long and low across the ramp. N44VC was gone. It had been towed to a flatbed 2 days ago and was on its way to the repair facility in Atlanta, where a team he'd never meet would do work he'd never see, and the aircraft would eventually return to service properly documented and properly fixed. He thought about what it meant to fix something properly. Not the fastest way or the cheapest way or the way that fit most neatly into someone's benchmark. The actual way. The way that meant the problem was solved and not just reclassified, that the record reflected what had actually happened inside the machine, that the next person who looked at it would know the truth of it. That was the job. It had always been the job. It was the same job whether you were doing it in a certification lab at Hartwell, or a conference room in Midtown, or a rust-sided hangar at the edge of a county road in eastern Oklahoma. He picked up his cold coffee and drank it anyway. The independent safety oversight document Nathan sent to Victoria on a Friday afternoon ran 12 pages, and she read it twice before forwarding it to her board with a cover note that was 3 sentences long and said, in effect, "This is what we're doing." She'd expected pushback. She got some. 2 board members raised concerns about the cost structure of an external safety function, and one raised the question of whether implementing Nathan's recommendations too aggressively might be read by the market as an admission of deeper liability than the company had publicly acknowledged. Victoria listened to all of it in the board call on a Tuesday evening, sitting at her desk with the document open on her laptop and the city going dark outside her window. And when everyone had finished, she said that she understood the concerns and was going to implement the recommendations anyway, and that anyone who wanted to discuss it further could call Briggs. Nobody called Briggs. What followed was not a clean process. Clean processes existed in press releases and quarterly reports. The actual work of rebuilding a maintenance culture that had been quietly degrading for 14 months was messier than any document could anticipate. Helena Dross drove it from the inside, and Nathan came to understand over the following weeks that Helena was the right person for that job in a way that wasn't immediately obvious from the conference room. She was methodical without being rigid, and she had the quality, rare in people who'd worked long enough inside a broken system to be made deputy by it, of genuine willingness to be wrong about what she thought she knew. Nathan had 3 more calls with Helena in December. The first was about the dual authorization protocol for maintenance closures. She'd drafted it and wanted him to review the fault classification thresholds. He went through it section by section and flagged 2 places where the language was ambiguous in ways that would allow the shortcut to creep back in through interpretation. And she rewrote those sections and sent them back, and they were better. The second call was about the resquawk tracking system she was building, which was more complex than it sounded because the existing maintenance software didn't have a native field for it, and the workaround her team had built was going to require a manual reconciliation step that she was worried would become the first thing dropped when people got busy. He suggested an alternative structure. She improved on it. The third call was about training, specifically about what a technical training session for maintenance technicians should cover when the goal was not just skill transfer, but something harder to name: the restoration of professional confidence in people who had spent over a year inside a system that rewarded them for trusting the system over their own judgment. That one took longer. They talked for 2 hours, and at the end, Nathan wasn't sure they'd solved it, but he thought they'd identified the shape of the problem clearly enough to work with, which in his experience was usually the most you could do in a first real conversation about a hard thing. The FAA's formal findings came out in the 3rd week of January. They were, in Nathan's reading, accurate and fair, which was not always a guarantee with regulatory documents of that size and complexity. The findings confirmed the 31 underdocumented closures, documented the efficiency benchmark Webb had implemented and its role in creating the conditions for systematic shortcuts, and identified 4 structural deficiencies in Caldwell Aviation's maintenance oversight that aligned closely with what Nathan had told them in his recorded interview in Oklahoma City. The findings also included something Nathan hadn't expected: a technical citation. In the section documenting the inspection methodology that had identified the initial fault on N44VC, the report cited his bore scope analysis and oil filter assessment by name, noted his original role in the TF-77 engine family certification program, and described his inspection as consistent with the highest standards of the applicable maintenance manual. It was bureaucratic language, and it was also, in the specific context of a formal FAA enforcement document, the closest thing to a commendation that the regulatory process produced. Kowalski texted him the morning the findings were released. Saw the citation. Ehrlich would have approved. Nathan read it at the workbench and set his phone down and went back to what he was doing, which was rebuilding a carburetor for a Cessna 172 that a local flight instructor had brought in the week before. The carburetor was straightforward work, and he did it without thinking about it too hard, which was its own kind of satisfaction. Marcus Webb was terminated by Caldwell Aviation in December, 3 days after the FAA's preliminary report identified the efficiency benchmark and its origin. The termination was not publicly announced, which was standard practice, but it filtered into the industry press within a week through the usual channels. A brief item in an aviation trade publication described him as departing amid the company's ongoing maintenance review. Webb's attorney issued a statement characterizing his client's actions as good faith operational management within his authority. The FAA's enforcement division was still reviewing whether individual sanctions were warranted. That process moved at its own pace, and Nathan had no involvement in it. He thought about Webb occasionally, not with satisfaction, not with anything that felt like justice delivered. More with the specific discomfort of knowing that Webb was probably not a monster, that he was, most likely, a man who had made a series of decisions inside an incentive structure that rewarded those decisions, and who had convinced himself along the way people do, that efficiency and safety were compatible at the pace he was demanding, that the technicians understood what mattered, that the Category 3 closures were a reasonable industry practice and not a slow accumulation of deferred risk. Nathan had met enough webs to know that they rarely thought of themselves as the villain in their own story. They thought of themselves as operators, pragmatists, people who understood that the real world required trade-offs. The problem with that framing was that the trade-offs were never theirs to make. The trade-off between inspection time and schedule pressure was not a trade-off Webb was exposed to. He flew commercial, occasionally chartered, always on aircraft maintained by other people's standards. The passengers aboard Caldwell Aviation's fleet, 1,400 a day, the number Victoria had given him in the hangar that first afternoon, were the ones exposed to the trade-off, and they didn't know they were making it. They'd handed their trust to a system and assumed the system deserved it. That was the thing that Nathan came back to in the quiet hours of December and January. Not the technical failure, he understood those clearly, and they had a defined solution. The other failure, the failure of stewardship. The particular breach of responsibility that happened when the people inside a system stopped protecting the people who trusted it from the outside, and nobody noticed and decided it was someone else's problem, or noticed and decided the frame Webb provided was reasonable enough to accept. It was an old failure. It was as old as any human institution that handled risk on behalf of people who couldn't evaluate that risk themselves. Aviation, medicine, infrastructure, finance. The names of the industries changed and the technical details changed, but the shape of it didn't. Someone held authority. Someone benefited from shortcuts. Someone deferred. And somewhere further down the line, the cost landed on people who had no voice in any of those decisions. What was less old, or at least less guaranteed, was what happened after. Not the regulatory consequence, not the executive departure, not the press cycle. What happened after in the organization itself. Whether the people inside it learned something real or learned only how to avoid the specific form of the failure that had been exposed. Whether the culture shifted or just the surface of the culture shifted, the way surfaces shift when they're under scrutiny and settle back into their old shapes when the scrutiny passes. Nathan couldn't know that from Harlan County. He could do what he'd done, write the document, have the calls with Helena, tell the truth in the conference room and the FAA interview. And then it became the work of people inside the organization, which was where that work had to live. He couldn't do it for them. Nobody could. He knew that. He also knew that knowing it didn't make the uncertainty more comfortable. The first Caldwell Aviation aircraft to return to service after the inspections was N44VC, which felt like either symmetry or coincidence depending on how you thought about those things. The Atlanta repair facility had done the work, bearing seal replacement, first stage turbine blade inspection, and 2 blade replacements, full documentation, all of it, and the aircraft had been recertified in the second week of January and returned to Caldwell Aviation's Operations Center. Victoria called Nathan the day it went back into service. It was a Saturday afternoon and he was in the hangar, which was where he was most Saturdays. M44VC flew this morning, she said. New York to Palm Beach. Clean. Good, he said. The clients were... A pause. They were not warm about the grounding. To put it mildly, we've lost 4 charter contracts, possibly more to come. Her voice was even about it. She wasn't asking for reassurance. I'm sorry about that, he said, and meant it in the specific way you mean something you can't fix. It's a consequence, she said, not the worst one. A pause. The worst one is what we narrowly avoided, and I'm trying to keep that in the correct position in my thinking. It keeps wanting to move. He understood that. The averted disaster was always the hardest thing to hold clearly because it had no physical reality, no wreckage, no moment where the cost became undeniable. It was only ever a space where something terrible had not happened, and spaces like that were very easy for the mind to fill with other concerns once the immediate pressure receded. How many aircraft back in service so far? He asked. 63 cleared and returned as of this morning. We've got a phased schedule. Helena's managing it. Should have the full fleet cleared within 6 weeks, assuming nothing unexpected in the remaining inspections. A pause. We found 2 more above the particulate threshold during the ground inspections. Neither had the blade deposits you found on N44VC, but both needed filter replacement and seal evaluation before clearance. Good that you found them. Yes. The word had a weight to it that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite grief. something in between, the particular feeling of a near miss that you're only fully able to see after the fact. They were quiet for a moment. The advisory role, she said. Briggs said you hadn't followed up. I've been thinking about it. And? He looked around the hangar, at the Cessna 172 that had come in for its annual and was about a third of the way through. At the fuel flow valve on his workbench, finally calibrated and waiting to go back into the aircraft it came from. At the legal pad with the grid of numbers that was still there, turned face down now, under a stack of maintenance manuals. The scope would need to be defined clearly, he said. I'm not available to be on call for operational questions. My primary work is here. I understand that. And the oversight document I sent, that's the foundation. If the advisory role is about implementing that, genuinely implementing it, and not as a liability management exercise, I'm interested. If it's about having a name on a letterhead, it's not, she said. I'll have Briggs draft a scope document. You tell me what's wrong with it. I can do that. Another pause, a longer one, with a different quality than the ones earlier in their acquaintance. The silences between them had changed over the weeks. Less guarded, less loaded with position and implication. They were the silences of people who had established, through a series of difficult conversations, that they could tell each other the truth, which was not a small thing and was rarer than it should have been. Mr. Cole, she said. Nathan, he said. They'd been using first names for about 3 weeks, and she still occasionally reverted, which he'd decided was less formality than a habit of professional distance that she was working on. Nathan. A pause. I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly. Okay. What you did, calling the FAA when you did, before you had any idea how I was going to respond, without knowing whether I'd make your life difficult or try to discredit your findings, that took something. And I don't mean courage in the dramatic sense. I mean the specific, unglamorous kind of integrity that most people talk about and very few people actually maintain when it costs them something. Her voice was careful now, precise in the way it got when she was saying something she'd thought about. You could have shown me the grid and waited to see which way the wind blew. You could have called the FAA after we'd had a longer conversation. You didn't. You called when you found what you found because it was the right call to make. He was quiet for a moment. I appreciate that, he said. Truly. I'm not looking for modesty about it. I'm not being modest, I'm just... He paused, trying to find the accurate version. It wasn't a calculated decision. It was just what the situation called for. I found something real. The right place for real findings to go is the FAA. That's the system. A pause. I've seen what happens when you don't use the system. You end up with 14 months of Category 3 closures and 31 aircraft flying on deferred risk. The system exists for a reason. Most people who believe that still find reasons not to use it when it's inconvenient. Most people haven't written the maintenance manual, he said, and then, because that sounded more self-congratulatory than he intended. Or maybe they just haven't had a supervisor like Ehrlich. She made a sound that might have been a small laugh. It was hard to tell. She was economical with those. Tell me about Ehrlich. So he did. He told her about a man who had spent 30 years in propulsion engineering and believed, with the specific tenacity of someone who had seen what happened when the belief lapsed, that a maintenance record was not paperwork, that it was a conversation with the next person who would stand in front of that machine, and that the quality of that conversation determined whether the next person had what they needed to do their job safely. Ehrlich had reviewed Nathan's first inspection report at Hartwell and handed it back with 12 pages of margin notes, and Nathan had felt, briefly and intensely, that he'd failed at something fundamental, and Ehrlich had said, no, you wrote a report about what you saw. I'm asking you to write a report that tells the next person what they need to know. Those are not the same document. He'd been 28. He'd rewritten the report. Ehrlich had handed it back with 2 margin notes. What happened to him? Victoria asked. Retired? Lives in Vermont, I think. We don't talk often. Nathan looked at the legal pad under the maintenance manuals. He wrote me a letter when I left Hartwell. Paper letter, envelope, the whole thing. Said the industry had a way of losing the people it most needed to keep, and that he hoped I'd find my way back to it in some form. Did you write back? Eventually, about a year after I settled here. He paused. Told him I was running maintenance on single-engine Cessnas and crop dusters and the occasional biz jet. He wrote back and said that a well-maintained Cessna 172 was exactly as important as a well-maintained G700, and that anyone who told me differently didn't understand what maintenance was for. Victoria was quiet for a moment. He sounds like someone I'd want to hire. He'd have retired again inside a week. He had very little patience for meetings. This time she did laugh. It was brief and genuine and surprised him slightly, and he thought it probably surprised her too. By the end of February, the Caldwell aviation fleet was fully cleared and back in service. The resquawk tracking system Helena had built caught 3 faults in the first month that would previously have moved through a Category 3 closure. Each of them was escalated, physically inspected, and properly documented. One of the 3 turned out to be a legitimate sensor issue. The other 2 were real faults that needed real repair. The dual authorization protocol for closure sign-offs produced, in the first 4 weeks, a 17% increase in the time it took to close a maintenance squawk and a measurable decrease in the resquawk rate for closed faults, which was the metric that actually mattered and which, for the first time in Caldwell Aviation's history, was being tracked. Helena sent Nathan the first monthly safety metrics report in early March. He read it at his workbench with his coffee and made a few notes in the margin and sent it back with 3 observations, one of which she'd already identified and 2 of which she hadn't. She replied within the hour, which was a response time that told him the work was getting the attention it deserved. The independent safety function, reporting directly to the board's audit committee, with no operational reporting line, was formally established in March, staffed by a director named Osei, who had 22 years in aviation safety and had spent the last 5 at an independent certification body. Nathan had a call with Osei in early March to walk him through the structural recommendations and found him to be exactly the kind of person that role needed. Someone who understood the technical reality well enough to ask the right questions and the organizational reality well enough to know where the pressure points were. The efficiency benchmark, Osei said during that call. You said it propagated without a memo, without explicit instruction. Right. How do I build something that catches that? The invisible culture signal. Nathan thought about it. You can't build a detector for it directly, but you can build something that makes the invisible visible. You track the metrics I outlined: resquawk rate, root cause identification rate, physical inspection completion. If a station is consistently closing squawks fast and the resquawk rate starts drifting up, that's your signal. You're not catching the culture, you're catching its output. A pause. And you have to talk to technicians, not through surveys. Actually talk to them, individually, without their supervisors present. You're looking for the gap between what the policy says and what people actually feel safe doing. That takes time, Osei said. Yes, Nathan said. It takes exactly as much time as it takes. Osei absorbed that. The original benchmark, Webb's benchmark, it was about saving time. Yes. And the solution costs time. Correct. So the argument I'm going to have to make to operations indefinitely is that the time it costs is worth it. That's the argument, Nathan said. The good news is that argument has evidence behind it now. You've got 31 closures and 4 aircraft above particulate threshold and a grounding that costs millions in lost contracts. That's your evidence. Use it. Evidence has a shelf life, Osei said. People forget. I know. Nathan paused. That's why your job exists. In April, Ella came home for spring break and found her father in the hangar on a Tuesday morning working on an engine teardown for a Piper Seneca that a local flight school had brought in. She sat on the spare stool and watched him work for 20 minutes before she said anything, which was her version of a greeting when she wanted to think. The Caldwell thing, she said eventually. Is it done? Mostly, he said without looking up. The fleet's cleared. The oversight structure is in place. I've got a few more calls with Helena through the end of the quarter. And the advisory role? You signed that? Signed it in February. Scope? He glanced at her. She'd started asking about his work differently in the last few months, more specifically with more technical context. The engineering program was doing what it was supposed to do. Quarterly review of the safety metrics reports, annual review of the closure protocol, available for consultation on specific technical questions, defined hours, defined rate. That's not a lot. It's what I agreed to, he said. I'm not going to be in New York every week. That's not what this is. She looked around the hangar for a moment, at the piper on the lift, at the tools on the workbench, at the legal pad. He'd moved it to a shelf, still face down, and at the windsock visible through the door. Are you happy with how it went? She asked. He set down the tool he was holding and thought about it honestly because she deserved an honest answer and would know the difference. I'm satisfied with what I found and what I did about it, he said. I'm uncertain about what happens inside that organization over time, whether it holds. He looked at the Piper engine. That's always the uncertainty. You can fix the machine. The machine will tell you if the fix worked. You can't audit a culture the same way. But you tried. I did what I could from where I am, he said. Which is here. She nodded. Then, Ehrlich. He looked at her. What about him? You talked about him more in the last few months than you have in years. He hadn't noticed that consciously. He noticed it now. I suppose I have. Because of this? He thought about that, about the margin notes on the inspection report, about the paper letter in the envelope, about sitting in a conference room in Midtown telling a room full of people what a maintenance record was for. Not paperwork, but a conversation with the next person who would stand in front of the machine. Because what he taught me turned out to matter more than I remembered, he said. And that reminded me that I hadn't thanked him for it properly. Have you? I called him in February. He picked up the tool again. We talked for an hour. He's taken up woodworking. Apparently he's terrible at it. Ella smiled. It was a good smile, wide and quick and entirely her own. What did he say? About the Caldwell thing. Nathan was quiet for a moment, hearing the old man's voice on the phone the way you hear voices that have shaped you, present even when they're not in the room, part of the furniture of how you think. He said, Good, now go fix the Cessna. She laughed. He went back to the engine. There was something Nathan had learned in 8 years at Harlan County Municipal Airport that he hadn't expected to learn when he arrived there. Hadn't expected because he'd arrived in the mood of someone who was pausing between things, not someone who was arriving at something. He'd thought of the hangar as a landing zone, a place to be while he figured out the next version of his life. And at some point, the landing had become the thing itself, and he hadn't fully noticed the moment it happened. The work was the same work. That was the thing nobody told you about expertise, that it didn't shrink when the context around it shrunk, that what you knew didn't become less true because the room you were in was smaller or the aircraft were less expensive, or nobody in the nearest city knew your name. A TF-77 bearing seal was a TF-77 bearing seal, whether you were looking at it in a Gulfstream G700 at 31,000 feet over eastern Oklahoma, or in a hangar with a rust-stained exterior wall at the edge of a county road. The failure mode was the same, the inspection was the same, the record you wrote afterward was the same. What changed was the pressure, and what he'd learned, what the years here had given him that the years at Hartwell hadn't quite managed to, was a clearer sense of his own judgment uncoupled from the judgment of the room. At Hartwell, the room had always been present. The benchmark, the timeline, the organizational culture that rewarded certain kinds of certainty and certain kinds of speed. Here, the room was mostly him and the aircraft and the tools and the question of what was actually true. And he'd gotten very good, over 8 years, at answering that question without reference to anything else. That was what he'd brought into the conference room in Midtown. Not his credentials, though those had mattered for establishing the technical ground. Not his history at Hartwell, though that had been useful. What he'd brought was the 8 years of answering the question without reference to anything else. The habit of seeing what was actually there. He didn't think of himself as a hero of the story. He was aware the narrative had taken that shape in certain press accounts. The lone mechanic, the forgotten expert, the rural hangar versus the billion-dollar empire. And he understood why that shape was appealing, why human beings organized events into those kinds of stories, because they made sense of things in ways that straight chronology didn't. He just knew it wasn't quite right. He hadn't set out to expose anything. He'd set out to look at an engine and tell the truth about what he found. The rest was what happened when you did that. What the story was actually about, in his view, if stories could be said to be about things in a specific rather than a general sense, was the cost of not saying what you saw. Not Webb's decisions, though those mattered. The 20 months of small decisions by dozens of people who had seen something, had felt a version of the concern Sue had described, and had accepted the frame they were given because the alternative required a kind of friction they weren't prepared to sustain. That was the real cost. Not in the abstract, but in 31 specific aircraft, in 4 transatlantic crossings, in 1,400 daily passengers who had handed their trust to a system and been, for a period of time, on the wrong side of that trust without knowing it. The friction was the job. That was what he'd learned from Ehrlich, stated plainly without the formality of a lesson. The friction of saying what you saw when what you saw was inconvenient was not a feature of the work that you managed around. It was the work. It was the whole point of having a standard at all, because a standard that only held when it was easy wasn't a standard, it was a preference. He wrote that down once, in the margin of the safety oversight document he sent to Victoria, and then he crossed it out because it sounded like the kind of thing people put on motivational posters, and he didn't want that. He kept the idea. He just put it back where it belonged, which was in the work, and not in the language around it. On a Thursday evening in late April, Nathan was closing up the hangar when a car he didn't recognize turned off the county road onto the access road. He watched it come, a rental by the look of it, something generic and silver, and when it parked by the apron and the driver got out, it took him a moment to place her. Castillo, the FAA Airworthiness Director from Oklahoma City. She was dressed casually, jacket over jeans, and she walked toward him without the official quality she'd had in the conference room. "Miss Castillo," he said, "this is unexpected." "I was in Tulsa for a regional review," she said. "I drove out." She looked at the hangar. "I wanted to see it." He looked at the hangar with her for a moment, trying to see it through her eyes. The rust-orange corrugated siding, the new sodium lamp above the door, casting a clean white circle in the growing dusk, the windsock going easy in the evening air. "It's a hangar," he said. "It's where it started," she said. She looked at him. "The Hartwell connection. I went back and looked at the certification records after your interview. Your name is on the original TF-77 type certificate documentation." "It is." "You were 31 when you did that work." 30 to 33 across the program." "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment. "You should have come back to the industry." "You're the second person to say that to me." "We're both right." "I am in the industry," he said. The same thing he told Victoria months ago, in a different dusk. Castillo looked at the hangar and then at the ramp and then at the flat country going out to the horizon in the low light. "The advisory role with Caldwell. You took it. Limited scope, quarterly." "I heard." A pause. "The FAA's Maintenance Oversight Division is putting together a working group. Engine fault documentation standards, specifically around Category 2 and 3 closure protocols across the private aviation sector. The Caldwell case identified gaps that aren't specific to Caldwell." She looked at him directly. "I'd like to put your name forward as a technical advisor." He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the hangar, at the Piper Seneca inside it, which he'd finish next week, at the 172 waiting after that. "What would that involve?" he asked. 4 meetings over 12 months, Washington mostly. We'd cover your travel. There's a small honorarium." She paused. "Your work product from the Caldwell inspection, the technical memo, the bore scope documentation, it's already being referenced internally as a model for how closure protocol violations should be identified and documented. It would be useful to have you in the room when we're revising the standards." He thought about Ehrlich's margin notes, about writing a report that told the next person what they needed to know. "Send me the terms," he said. "I'll look at them." Castillo nodded. She looked at the hangar one more time. "Ehrlich trained you," she said. It wasn't a question. "He did." "I reviewed one of his reports once, early in my career. It was referenced in an accident investigation, a case from the 90s, propulsion fault on a regional commuter. His inspection report from 6 months earlier had flagged the precursor condition. Nobody acted on it in time. A pause. His documentation was impeccable. You could see exactly what he'd found and exactly what it meant. The report had done everything right. It was the system that hadn't. Nathan was quiet. He wasn't responsible for the accident, Castillo said. In case you're wondering, the investigation was clear on that. But I always thought about what it must have cost him to have seen it, documented it correctly, and still watched it happen. Nathan thought about that for a moment, about the weight of that kind of clarity. To have been precise and right, and to have had the right thing fail anyway. About what it meant to carry that and still show up the next morning and write the next report with the same precision, because the alternative was to let the failure of the system become the failure of the standard, and that was not something Ehrlich would have done. He came back the next morning, Nathan said. He wasn't certain of that as a fact. He was certain of it as a truth. Castillo looked at him. Yes, she said. I imagine he did. She left as the last of the light was going, the silver rental turning back down the access road toward the county highway. Nathan stood by the hangar door for a while after, the new sodium lamp above him, the windsock trailing still in the evening air. He thought about all the aircraft in the air right now. Not Caldwell Aviation specifically, just the general fact of it, the thousands of aircraft crossing the dark sky in every direction, carrying people who were reading or sleeping or looking out the window at the lights below, all of them trusting a system they would never fully see. Trusting the inspections and the records and the people who wrote the reports and the people who read them and the long chain of professional obligation that ran from the engine to the sky and back. Most of the time the chain held. Most of the time the work was done the way it was supposed to be done, and the aircraft flew and landed and flew again, and nobody had occasion to think about the maintenance record or the person who wrote it. That was the normal condition, the anonymous, unnoticed, ordinary functioning of a standard maintained. He went inside and turned off the workbench light and closed up the hangar. He drove home on the county road in the dark, the F250 running the way it always ran. Not well, not badly, reliably. Ella had left a note on the kitchen table saying she'd gone to a late movie with a friend and there was soup on the stove. He ate the soup standing at the counter. It was good. She'd learned to cook somewhere along the way without making a project of it, which was very much her style. He washed the bowl and put it away and went to bed at a reasonable hour. In the morning, he drove back to the hangar and unlocked the door and started the coffee and pulled on his gloves and got back to work on the Piper Seneca engine the way he had every morning for 8 years. The way he intended to for the foreseeable future. Not because no larger stage had ever offered itself, but because he'd understood something, slowly and without drama, about the relationship between where you stood and what you could see clearly from there. He could see clearly from here. That turned out to matter more than the size of the room. The coffee finished brewing. Outside, the morning light came across the flat country in long, steady lines, and the windsock moved in the first wind of the day. And somewhere at 31,000 feet, an aircraft with clean maintenance records and a properly documented bearing seal was carrying people through the sky, and nobody aboard it would ever know his name. That was fine. That was exactly fine.